Hello, hello, hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I'm the sort of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien in general. And welcome to another episode where I answer your questions. Of course, if you want to ask a question, you can do so in the comments. I get to those whenever I can. But if you want to be featured in a video, you want to use a website called Quora. Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant knowledge or expertise or experience answer it. And whenever you ask a question about The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, or Tolkien in general, on Quora, you're going to get a list of names of people that you could specify. I would like to request an answer from this person, and my name will be at or near the top of that list. If you like the video, I'm going to ask that you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button and all that good stuff. We have 10 questions to get through today, but first we're going to do a reading. And for that reading, I was thinking, I actually don't have it handy, do I? Well, that was a lot easier. I was going to do something, a little bit of, let's see. I wanted to do a poem, actually. And let's see if I can find it, because it's relevant to a later... Here it is. I want to read you... Well, there's a poem that I'm going to read later, but there's two other poems that I'm going to read now. And if you have the book The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, I'm going to read the 9th poem, which is called The Mulips. The 10th poem is Oliphant, and I'm going to read that later as a part of a question. And then the 11th poem is Fastidikalan, and I'm going to read that one as well. And then, just for good measure, I'm going to throw in Cat, which is the 12th poem. And these are sort of Tolkien's views on specific creatures in Middle-earth that are... Well, I mean, cats are obviously real, but some of them are sort of folklore and sort of maybe based on real creatures. We're going to talk about that more later. But I wanted to read these specific poems today. So we're going to start with poem number 9 in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is The Mulips. The shadows where the Mulips dwell are dark and wet as ink, and slowly and softly rings their bell, as in the slime you sink. You sink into the slime who dare to knock upon their door, while down the grinning gargoyles stare and noisome waters pour. Beside the rotting river strand the drooping willows weep, and gloomily the gore-crows stand croaking in their sleep. Over the Murloc mountains a long and weary way, in a mouldy valley where the trees are grey, by a dark pool's borders without wind or tide, moonless and sunless the Mulips hide. The cellars where the Mulips sit are deep and dank and cold, with single sickly candle lit, and there they count their gold. Their walls are wet, their ceilings drip, their feet upon the floor, so softly with a squish flap flip as they slide to the door. They peep out slyly through a crack, their feeling fingers creep, and when they've finished in a sack, your bones they take to keep. Beyond the Murloc mountains, a long and lonely road, through the spider shadows and the marsh of toad, and through the wood of hanging trees and the gallows weed, you go to find the Mulips, and the Mulips feed. We're going to talk a little bit more about the idea of Mulips and what it means in the context of Middle-earth here, but I'm going to skip over Oliphant because I'm going to read that later as a part of the answer that I'm alluding to. So we're going to skip to the next one, which was Fastidikalan. Look, there is a Fastitacalon, an island good to land upon. Although 'tis rather bare, come leave the sea and let us run, or dance or lie down in the sun. See, gulls are sitting there, beware. Gulls do not sink, there they may sit or strut and prink. Their part it is to tip the wink if anyone should dare upon that isle to settle, or if only for a while to get relief from sickness or the wet, or maybe boil a kettle. Ah, foolish folk who land on him, and little fires proceed to trim, and hope perhaps to tea. It may be that his shell is thick. It seems to sleep, but he is quick, and floats now in the sea with guile. And when he hears their tapping feet, or faintly feels the sudden heat, with smile he dives, and promptly turning upside down, he tips them off, and deep they drown, and lose their silly lives. To their surprise, be wise. There are many monsters in the sea, but none so perilous as he, old horny Fastitacalon, whose mighty kindred have all gone, the last of the old turtle fish. So if to save your life you wish, then I advise, pay heed to the sailor's ancient lore, set foot on no uncharted shore, or better still your days at peace in Middle-earth, in mirth, fulfill. So, sort of the idea of a giant sort of sea creature, a giant like turtle-like thing, and Fastitacalon seems to actually be a name of a specific one, not the name of a breed of them. Although you could assume that that's just the way that the hobbits wrote about it, who would, look like an island, and then you'd go on the island, and then it would flip over, and you would drown. And we don't know why he would do that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I'm going to read Cat. Cat is interesting. It's a very short poem, and Tolkien was not very fond of cats, but he wrote a poem called Cat, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Tolkien and cats in just a bit, but let's read this short little poem called Cat, which I'm including in here because he did speak about it in his letters when he talked about Mulips and Fastitacalon. So, the fat cat on the mat may seem to dream of nice mice that suffice for him or cream. For he free may be, walks in thought, unbowed, proud, where loud roared and fought his kin, lean and slim, or deep in den, in the east feasted on beasts and tender men. The giant lion with iron, claw in paw, and huge ruthless tooth in gory jaw, the pard dark-starred, fleet upon feet, that oft soft from aloft leaps upon his meat, where woods loom in gloom, fat now they be, fierce and free and tamed is he, but fat cat on the mat, kept as a pet, he does not forget. So I love this sort of thought that domesticated cats have not forgotten, sort of where they came from and their whole history. It's interesting here is that this could just be a poem about cats, and it doesn't need to have any sort of connection to Middle-earth or the Legendarium or any of Tolkien's works, except for the fact that in the line, in the east feasted on beasts, he capitalizes the word east. And this is interesting because there's two stanzas to this poem, and they're really just two very long sentences. So for the first stanza, it starts with the, as in the fat cat on the mat, and the is capitalized. And then nothing is capitalized except for the word east, because he's using it as a proper noun, as in the east. And then the second sentence, the only word once again is the, as in the giant lion with iron. So really, he just wrote two very long and very complex sentences in a poetic sense, and also a very interesting rhyming scheme. What's really interesting here is that Tolkien actually disliked cats. Now, some will say that he disliked cats in general, and some will say that he only disliked certain types of cats. In one of his letters, he was told about some Siamese cats that somebody was raising that were being named after some of his characters from The Lord of the Rings. And in his reply, it wasn't from the person who was raising the cats. The person who wrote him was just mentioning that they know a person who is doing that, a woman who is raising Siamese cats and naming them after characters from The Lord of the Rings. And what's really interesting is that Tolkien said that to him, Siamese cats are the fauna of Mordor. Basically saying that he finds them to be evil or distrustful or perhaps vile in some sort of way. And it is interesting that he does specify Siamese cats and not generally cats in general. But it is interesting in that one of his earliest legendarium stories, which was the Lay of Leithian, which became of Beren and Luthien in the Silmarillion, the character that was going to be Sauron was actually a large black cat, the Prince of Cats, whose name was Tevildo. And it's not that Sauron was a cat or that he was ever named Tevildo, in that essentially he took Tevildo out of the story and then put Sauron in his place, or I should say he put a character named Thu the Necromancer in his place, who, Thu becomes Gorthaur, which was the name that some elves, specifically in Beleriand, had for Sauron, whereas outside of Beleriand, it was more common to call him Sauron rather than Gorthaur. They're both insulting names that the elves came up with. But we see a very sort of cats are evil and dogs are good theme in the earliest Lay of Leithian. Because we see that, of course, Tevildo is the Prince of Cats, and he's a servant and pet of Melko, and one of the great heroes is Huon, the Hound of Valinor. We also, cats are mentioned, once or twice in The Hobbit, in The Lord of the Rings, but the biggest mention of cats as creatures that exist in Middle-earth is actually related to a queen of Gondor. One of the kings of Gondor had a wife named Beruthiel, and Beruthiel was sort of a wicked lady. She was not very nice, and the way that she expressed herself in sort of a rude and nasty manner was that she would find out people's secrets and use them against them, and the way that she found out their secrets is that she had cats that she would use as spies. I guess she could speak to the cats, and they would listen and hear people's secrets and then report back to her, and then she would sort of, blackmail people, and sort of get whatever it is that she wanted, which was probably just sort of a sense of satisfaction. So we see that, time and time again, Tolkien comes back to this idea that cats are bad, but we also see in this poem that there is sort of a respect that even the fat cat on the mat, as in the domesticated, weird orange tabby that you have with, just two brain cells to rub together every once in a while, is connected to these fantastic beasts like lions and tigers and such that are animals that predate upon other animals, and that they're very fearsome, and that they may even predate upon men, and that he feels that the cats have not forgotten this sort of heritage, and maybe that's why he sort of distrusted them. It may or may not be the case. At one point, the Tolkiens did have a cat. The way that he wrote about it was very interesting. He said, "We have acquired a cat." You could tell that he wasn't really completely on board with it from the wording of "we have acquired a cat." But Tolkien was interesting about the things that he would become attached to, even if he didn't necessarily trust them. For example, he did not trust machines, and he certainly did not he did not trust automobiles. Cars, in his mind, were too fast. He did not like how they took you through the scenery so fast that you didn't really appreciate it, and he didn't like the way they looked or smelled or anything like that. But he did enjoy the act of actually driving, although he wasn't very good at it. He would basically, instead of driving the car, he would basically aim the car in a general direction, and he sort of treated the car as if he were a knight and the car was his steed, and he thought if he would charge, then everyone else would scatter, which, is not a terribly great way to drive. Of course, after a while, his wife insisted that she would never get into the car if he was driving. But he even gave the car a name, though. He was attached to it in some small way that he personified it. He called it Joe. He also referred to it as the machine when he was feeling contemptuous towards it, but he also called it Joe, which was based on the numbers on the light. They called them number plates in England, but we would know them as license plate numbers started with J-O, so he called the car Joe. And I believe he had gotten a second car as well that he called Joe 2, which is not very inventive for a man that is extremely good at coming up with names and them being meaningful and everything. And I think this is just sort of showing his contempt that he could have come up with a better name for the car, or he could have just not named his car, but he chose to just go with Joe 2. It shows a little bit of his humor and a little bit of his contempt, but also having this strange sort of affinity for it. Anyway, we have 10 questions to get through, and we're going to start right now. Let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in from Deborah Borlays, who asks, Sauron had to know that Galadriel, Gandalf, Elrond, and/or Saruman held a ring of power after the council kicked him out of Dol Guldur. He didn't go after them. Could he have not used one of the three to help him, or force them to help him find the one? So the question here is based on a false premise. I would even say maybe a few false premises. So let's address that first. Sauron did not have to know anything. He may have harbored an inkling of which elves had the rings, though it is unlikely that he would guess that Gandalf or Saruman would have rings. And of course, Gandalf did have one. Since the question supposes that Sauron has to have knowledge based on being ousted from Mirkwood, I think the assumption is being made that the rings were used to oust him, and this isn't true, at least not according to Gandalf. While all three rings would be present, there's three things to consider. The first is that the rings that were on the hands of Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf would not be visible to Sauron any more than they were visible to Samwise. The only person who was stated to have seen Galadriel's ring was Frodo, because he had the One Ring. And Galadriel specifically revealed it to him. Sam, who was with Frodo, could not see the ring. Frodo also never noted that there was a ring on Gandalf's hand or one on Elrond's hand. Those were only visible after the One Ring had been destroyed. The second thing to consider is that even if the rings were visible to Sauron for some reason, which they weren't, but let's say for the sake of argument that they were, he probably wasn't close enough to any member of the council to actually see them. They came in force and he left. It seems that they drove him out with power, but it was later described as more of a tactical retreat to Mordor. It is likely that once he saw them coming, he decided, the jig is up, it's time to go, I've been exposed. The third thing to consider is the words of Gandalf. Gandalf himself had Narya, and of course Galadriel had Nenya and Elrond had Vilya, but he gave all the credit for ousting Sauron to Saruman the White, who had no ring of power. It was by his devices that the necromancer was driven out of Mirkwood, so it was a strategy or a glamour of Saruman that caused this to happen, not the rings of power. And it's really interesting because, you did acknowledge that maybe Sauron would think that Saruman had a ring of power, but the reason that I'm saying this is because Gandalf is basically saying that it was basically all Saruman, that he did everything, that it was like his operation and his devices. That tells us that the rings were not used, so there is no reason that Sauron would assume that the rings were being used against him. Now, to address the last part of the question, I would answer a question with a question. By what device would Sauron use the three to help him find the one? It is through the One Ring that he can control the bearers of the Rings of Power. Without it, he can't effect control over the three. He can effect control over the 9 because they are bound to him by being used by men while he held the one. However, the elves, and later Gandalf, only used the 3 after they knew that the one was lost and they believed that it would never be found. Galadriel is clear about her complex feelings about the One Ring being found, that if Sauron regains it, she must forsake the use of her own ring, and if the one is destroyed, her ring will lose its power. She sees an opportunity to sort of eat her cake and have it too by seizing the one for herself, becoming the Lord of the Rings, but she rejects this as it would just, make her as evil as Sauron was. So they really had nothing to worry about. Sauron may have deduced that, 2 of the rings were in Rivendell and Lothlorien, simply due to how opaque these realms were to his forces and to his sight. But there's no indication that he would know that, Gandalf had the third, and he cannot control the bearers as they were never bound to him. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of the Oski Boski, who asks, was Gandalf the White a fully potential Maya? Okay, so I find the question a little bit hard to parse, but I think what's being asked here is essentially, is Gandalf the White Gandalf seen at his full potential? And the answer is almost. Gandalf the White is far greater in power and majesty than his former iteration, Gandalf the Grey, to the point where he seems to be practically invincible, or at least he claims that the weapons of Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas cannot harm him. This is an important boast, as the sword that Aragorn carries is a new iteration of the one that killed Sauron in the past. He still states, black is mightier. That he is only the second most dangerous being in Middle-earth, but he may be accounting not for just Sauron himself, but for Sauron and the forces of all his armies. It was never going to be about fighting Sauron or even fighting his armies. That was mostly a distraction. The main crux of the quest was always going to be Frodo's task. The biggest show of power that Gandalf shows is in the most Gandalf way possible with his words. He, with just words, shatters Saruman's staff and deprives him of his power and station. Simply the statement, "Your staff is broken," causes the staff to break. Gandalf does not even make a gesture, as he normally does when he uses magic. This is because the great power afforded to him is not so much in the sense of might, but in the sense of authority. He was the White, and he had the authority to deprive Saruman of his station. Saruman was essentially no longer a wizard because the White proclaimed it to be so. However, this is not a fully unfettered Gandalf for one simple reason: he is still an incarnate. Though he may be tougher, he is not only still bound to one specific body and unable to forsake it or to change it to a different one, it's the same body that he had before. Were he fully unfettered, he could make any sort of body that he wished, or even have no body at all, and suffer no diminishment to his power or to his majesty. To put it in simple terms that Tolkien used, to any angel, whether they're a Vala or a Maya, their body is like their clothes. And they can cast aside or change their clothes without being harmed, just as anyone can change clothes or go without clothes and still be a complete person. Incarnates, though, their body is actually part of them. This is why Gandalf died. His body was too damaged to house his soul. When Saruman dies, he blows away on the wind because that body, that was killed was actually part of him. So it being damaged actually damaged his soul. In the case of Gandalf, though, he was made more powerful due to the intervention of Ilúvatar, that's God, who sent him back to his own body and empowered him further. Were Gandalf unleashed fully, he would no longer need to be in the guise of an old man. He would never need to rest or to eat or to drink anything. He wouldn't feel pain, and he may, through this, lose a connection that he had to the peoples of Middle-earth because he wouldn't identify with them as much, and he wouldn't have the experience of being like them, and that's why it was important for him to still be an incarnate, even as empowered as he was. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Link of Wise, who asks, why did Sauron not use the surviving dragons in his armies, while admittedly less powerful than they were once? Would they have not been useful to him as further additions to his forces? It is likely that whatever dragons there were, I think they existed outside of Sauron's reach. When Sauron's base of operations was in Mirkwood Forest, Gandalf worried about him using his magic to conscript the dragon Smaug to the northeast of him. After being driven from Mirkwood, or at least after making a tactical retreat, Sauron took up his throne in Mordor and declared himself openly. We know that Sauron's sphere of influence is vast, as Gollum got caught up in it when he was near to the borders of the Shire. However, we don't know if his magical sphere of influence extends much further to the north than this, and it likely does not. One thing that we have to understand when we look at maps is that we are only seeing a small bit of Middle-earth. Some of this is understood that the lands to the east and the south are off of the map, but rarely do we talk about what lies to the north, known as the Forodwaith, or the Northern Wastes. If we look at First Age maps of Beleriand, at least the ones created by Tolkien and his son, note that we do not see the fortress of Melkor, Angband, on the map. We are just meant to understand that there is an entire region to the north of Beleriand where Morgoth's fortress is. The very northernmost part of Arda, when the world was flat, would be the Iron Mountains and the Helcaraxa that connected Middle-earth to the Undying Lands. We know that when Morgoth came over the Helcaraxa, he was attacked by Ungoliant in a place that came to be known as Lameth. But this is not directly connected to the Helcaraxa, which we do not see on the map, but there is an unknown waste to the north of Lameth that likely connects to the Helcaraxa. Lameth is just where Morgoth and Ungoliant finally stopped and had their argument and their fight. We have never seen the Iron Mountains on any official Middle-earth map from the First Age onwards. The north border in the typical maps of Middle-earth is the Grey Mountains that spanned the north bit of Ravanian and the remnant of Angmar in the western part. So I'm talking about all this map stuff to say there is quite a lot to the north that we don't typically see, and this is where the last few dragons are. Smaug was said to travel to the south to reach Erebor, which in maps that we see is south of the Grey Mountains. We are told that the Grey Mountains are home to a lot of goblins, which is why Gandalf only feels safe traveling there after the Battle of the Five Armies. All, or at least nearly all of those, those goblins from those mountains were killed, and he has no fear of dragons. He doesn't mention that there might be dragons there, which means that wherever it was that Smaug came from, it was probably further to the north. So from all the way down in Mordor, it is likely that Sauron's call to evil creatures did not reach the dragons in the north. Perhaps he would have been able to reach them, from Mirkwood. We really don't know, but he had been driven out of there. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Deborah Borlase, who asks, after Sauron was finally defeated when the ring was destroyed, the orcs all fled and were without purpose. Why did this not happen, at least partially, when Sauron was defeated the first time and was without form? Was he so strong still? It probably did happen to a much lesser degree, but there's sort of two things that we need to consider that make the two situations very different from each other. They're really completely different circumstances. The first major difference between his first fall and his second fall are that the One Ring was not destroyed the first time. Sauron poured his own essence into the ring, essentially a large portion of his power, the greater part of it, in fact. So much of Sauron was tied up in the ring, but this power still actually existed as long as the One existed. Tolkien described it as being in rapport with the ring. He didn't know where the ring was, or even if it still existed, at least until he met Gollum, but the power in the ring was still his own. Once it was destroyed, so much of Sauron himself was now gone that he couldn't hold it together anymore. The magical sway he had over his armies was gone. It is likely that, something similar, though less severe, happened in the Second Age. But that brings us to the next point. In the Second Age, Sauron's armies were already defeated in a long war against men and elves, and his land was invaded, and he was occupied, and his tower was put under a long siege. There hadn't been any violence in years, other than an Aryan being killed by an object that had either fallen off of Barad-dûr or perhaps was thrown from it. Sauron came out to do battle 1-on-2 against the High Kings Elendil and Gil-galad, but there wasn't a great battle with his forces, as depicted in the film, that had already happened, and Sauron had lost. So while he may have had forces that were elsewhere, and his sway over of them would likely have slipped in this moment, there was not a grand army of orcs and such in Mordor at the time. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Brian Perkins, who asks, what did Sauron want with the 3 elven rings? Did he just covet them, or could he have done greater damage with them than he did with the original 16 plus the 1? I think in this case, you have to sort of see the whole thing from Sauron's perspective. Sauron's plan was to, teach the elves how to make the rings of power, and then leave them with their rings for a while, and he would go and he would create a master ring that could locate and control all of the bearers of the rings of power, essentially making the likes of Celebrimbor and several other important and powerful elves his thralls. Now, I've always said that Sauron kind of jumped the gun a little bit. He made the One Ring too quickly, and he didn't give the elves enough time to really become enamored with their rings. If he had waited longer, not only would he maybe have been able to control the elves, but they would have continued to make more rings without him, and meaning that the number of elves that he would gain control over would go up. Not only this, but if he had managed to gain control of Celebrimbor, he could have kept churning out even more rings and sold elves in Lindon on the idea when they had previously rejected it. Now, when he makes the One Ring, he suddenly, he's aware of all the rings of power and who's holding them, and the number is a little bit higher than he expected, 19 rings instead of 16. He also becomes aware that the 3 rings that Celebrimbor created after he left Eregion, that Sauron left Eregion, are better than all the others. They're more powerful, and therefore they're more seductive, because who would wish to have something that's so powerful and not use it? Once again, we're going from Sauron's perspective here. So in the mind of Sauron, everything's going great. The One Ring does exactly what it's supposed to do, and he discovers that aside from the 16 rings that he knew about, Celebrimbor is holding on to 3 extra ones, and they're more magnificent and powerful, fit for Elvish lords and kings. And then it all goes wrong. The elves sense him, and they say nope, and they forsake their rings. They won't wear them now. Celebrimbor goes off to Lothlorien, and he gives one to Galadriel, and he brings the other 2 to Erenni and Gil-galad. But Sauron is unaware of where they've gone, because suddenly nobody is wearing them or using them. He knows that there's 16 of them in Eregion, and he knows there's 3 more, possibly in Eregion, possibly elsewhere. He's frustrated that the elves would rather be free than powerful. And he's even more frustrated when he tortures Celebrimbor to death and the elf doesn't give up the location of the 3. So now there's 3 powerful rings out there not being used by anybody, and if nobody uses them, they're no good to him. So Sauron wants the rings very badly because he wants somebody to use them so that he could control them. Didn't work out with the elves, and it was pretty bad with the dwarves too. I mean, the rings made them worse. It contributed to the fall of their society, but he never gained full control over the dwarves, which is what he's really after. But with men, he gained his most powerful and loyal minions. The Nazgul are incredibly hard to kill. They're terrifying to mortals. They have no will of their own, and they cannot betray him. The thought that someone could wrest his ring from him and master it, never enters into his mind. He's the Lord of the Rings, and he controls the Nazgul fully. Imagine, if the Witch King had Vilya, and that he leads a group of 12 wraiths instead of 9. If the 3 fell into the hands of mortal men, we would have 3 Nazgul that would make the Witch King look like a puppy. And then there would still be 9 ordinary Nazgul on top of that. It would be very bad. So obviously that's why Sauron would really very much like to get those rings. All right, let's move on to the next question. So the next question is one of those follow-up questions that I mentioned last week. And I asked the people that I know at Quora about, hey, what's up with the follow-up questions? It tells us that it's a follow-up question, but it doesn't tell us what it's a follow-up to. And essentially what it means is that it has to do a little bit with their AI. And basically what it does is it looks for comments on questions that get a lot of views. And when it sees something with a question mark, it's a follow-up question, it submits it as a question that could be asked. So somebody left this as a comment on a question, and the site decided to present it and send it to me. So here it is. What does the epic 10-day battle between Gandalf and the Balrog tell us about the nature and power of Maiar in Middle-earth? Why was this confrontation so pivotal? It speaks a little bit to the power of these 2 incarnate Maiar, or rather to their stamina, but that was not the point of it, I don't think. It says a lot that Gandalf was able to fight and chase the Balrog known as Durin's Bane, not for 10 days, by the way, for 11 days, despite him being a Maia and carrying the ring of power that boosted his stamina. He's still an old man, and that is just an impressive feat. This is especially important when we consider that Gandalf's reaction upon finding out that the thing that he had faced unseen earlier that nearly destroyed him was a Balrog, and that he was already weary. He knew that it was going to be a very long battle, and he lamented that he was not in top shape. So it's impressive that an old man, ring of power or not, he's in a real body and it is aged, could fight and chase the Balrog for 11 days when he's already tired to begin with. We have to presume that not only was there no rest in this period, but there's no food or water. This going without food or water for 11 days was probably what actually killed him after he finally killed the Balrog. However, the narrative function of having these 2 fight for so long wasn't to show how powerful either one was, but to show that they are evenly matched. Before the fight began, when they were just flinging spells without seeing each other, Gandalf was blasted down a long stair by an explosion caused by the Balrog's counter to his door-closing spell. This wasn't a battle, at least not in the traditional sense, but it's Gandalf trying to block the way magically, and the Balrog undoing his spell created an explosion. Gandalf hoped that whatever it was that countered his spell was buried in rubble, but he also stated that this act nearly destroyed him and that he had met his match. At this point in the story, Gandalf is the most powerful force for good that is actively helping Frodo. I mean, Bombadil is also powerful, but his part in the story is very brief, and he's not actively helping Frodo anymore. With such powerful foes as Sauron and Saruman out there, having Gandalf on the side of good is a literal godsend, and now he's being removed from the story to make things all the more difficult. And how does Tolkien remove Gandalf, albeit temporarily? He introduces a force that is equal to Gandalf, but something that is not associated with the enemy. The Balrog has no current association with Sauron and no association at all with Saruman. It is unlikely that either of them knew of the Balrog. He is an agent of evil that exists separate from them. In one of the proposed adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, in the 1960s, there were several failed attempts at getting Tolkien to agree to an adaptation. The producers of one of these doomed animated projects suggested that Old Man Willow, the tree that tries to eat the hobbits in the Old Forest, was an agent of Sauron, and Tolkien was very annoyed by this, and he stated that that one could be evil without being, in his own words, in a deal with the devil. Not to mention, I think actually he said in league with the devil. Not that Sauron is the devil, but this is a metaphor. Sauron merely knows the devil. In the case of the Balrog, he is an agent of the devil, but he's not working with the primary antagonists. He is, in a sense, a diabolus ex machina, the evil side of the equation that is used to sort of cancel out Gandalf for a while. And of course, this leads to the eucatastrophe of his return later in the story. To get to this moment of elation, the eucatastrophe, we must first put the heroes in a sense of despair, breaking the Fellowship, Merry and Pippin captured, Boromir dead, and the snowball that got it all rolling was Gandalf, their guide, being removed from the story for a while. So that's why it's so pivotal. Let's move on to the next question. So we have another follow-up question here. So shout out to whoever left this as a comment and it got turned into a question. How did Galadriel know to send Gwaihir to find Gandalf? And was her insight possibly linked to her powers or communication with Eru or the Valar? My headset is falling. Let me just put that back up there. I don't believe that either Eru, Iluvatar, or the Valar were involved insofar as to Galadriel's foresight. The Valar had no part at all, and Eru just returned Gandalf to the world, but he did not likely tell Galadriel this information. Gandalf was dead for a few weeks before he returned, and he was alive on the mountaintop for a long while, recovering without being able to move, before Gwaihir came and scooped him up in his claws and bore him to Lothlorien. There, Galadriel was awaiting him with white robes and a new staff. So how did this happen? The easiest way to understand this is that Galadriel asked, not sent, Gwaihir to check on what happened at Zirak-Zigil, and the Eagle Lord, seeing Gandalf laying there, naked and battered, clutching his sword, decided to bring him back. Galadriel, knowing what was going to happen, prepared for Gandalf's arrival. A more complex idea would be that Gwaihir just happened by and then thought to bring him to Galadriel, but it requires that Galadriel will believe that Gandalf will arrive somehow and that Gwaihir just coincidentally finds him. It's sort of messy to think of it that way. Gwaihir does do favors for his friends. He's already done a favor for Gandalf. He's done a favor for Radagast. So we must ask, how did Galadriel know? She was not, as of yet, on speaking terms with the Valar, though she did sense the fact that by refusing the One Ring from Frodo that she had passed some sort of test and would be welcomed in the West. We aren't told of the Valar specifically contacting her. They could, of course, contact Gwaihir. He is an agent of Manwë. But we aren't told that she learned of what happened from Gwaihir. It's actually very easy to connect the dots. Starting with the arrival of the Fellowship in Lothlorien, we learned that Galadriel is surprised that Gandalf is not with him. She wished to speak with him, and he's not there. She is told that he fell in Moria. He's dead for a few weeks, and then the Fellowship stay in Lothlorien for nearly a month. During their stay, we learn of the Mirror of Galadriel. The way it worked in this chapter is that she invites Frodo and Sam to look into the water that makes up her mirror, not knowing what they may see, and warning them that it could be the past, it could be the present, or it could be a possible future. Frodo sees Sauron, while Sam sees the Shire being ruined, something that's not only a possible future, but may have actually, at this point, already been happening. The key, though, is that Galadriel states that while she is inviting Frodo and Sam to see what they see, she also states that she can command the mirror to show things. She isn't doing it in this scene, but she mentions offhand that she can control the mirror and what it shows. And we must ask ourselves, what is the point, on a literary level, of Galadriel just sort of casually mentioning that while she's not controlling what the mirror shows to the hobbits, that she can control what it shows? Then we wonder how exactly she knew where Gandalf's body would be, and we are told by the fact that she prepared not only clothes, but a new staff, that he is in fact alive. So the conclusion is that sometime after the Fellowship left Lothlorien, or sometime perhaps during the latter part of their stay, she commanded the mirror to show her where Gandalf was, or perhaps just to show her the area around Moria, and that she may have surveyed it for a while. And she saw that he was on the mountain and confirmed that he lived. Then she would have sent word to Gwaihir and asked a favor. Knowing that he died and then returned, she would have deduced that the only entity capable of that is Iluvatar himself, and that he would have need of a new staff and robes that were white. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Link of Wise, who asks, what would Sauron do if he got one of the Silmarils? So I don't think that Sauron ever really cared about the Silmarils. Keep in mind that Sauron is not Morgoth. They're very different. Sauron never showed any interest in the Silmarils, and it is possible that he viewed his master's obsession with him as part of Morgoth's eventual downfall. Sauron is far more practical than Morgoth was. Morgoth's desire for the Silmarils is part of his own personality of wanting to keep light for himself. If he can't own something totally, he destroys it. The Silmarils did not give Morgoth any sort of advantage, and even the act of wearing them on his crown was likely painful for him. Sauron, if he came across a Silmaril, would have to either be the one, cast into the sea by Maglor, or the one that was cast into the earth by Maethros. The one that Eärendil has is, far out of his reach. He would have to realize a few important truths. For one, the Silmaril offers him no power. Another important truth is that touching the Silmaril would be physically painful for him or any of his minions, and it would be, have to be contained and handled very carefully. That being said, the only practical application of a Silmaril for Sauron would be as a bargaining chip, really, something that, he certainly is not above using. In The Lord of the Rings, he was said to have offered 3 rings of power to Dain the Second Ironfoot in exchange for the location of Mr. Baggins. Now, I don't believe for a second that if Dain had given up Bilbo's location, that he would have actually received those rings, even if Sauron recovered the One Ring. The Rings of Power notoriously did not work on dwarves, and he would want to, keep those 3 rings to give to men. The offer was certainly a lie, but it was made. That being said, Sauron would find people who would wish to recover the Silmaril and offer it to them in exchange for something, and of course he would have to keep this a secret, and certainly not actually give the Silmaril to anyone, just get what he wants out of them, and then probably dispose of them. Though it would actually happen, he would have to, and this is just like I said, we're going back to Sauron's perspective here. Sauron has to think if he's holding onto the Silmarils and word gets out that he has one of them, that this news might reach the Undying Lands, and that they might unleash Feanor on him, which would, be very bad for him. And Sauron might convince himself that they would do this because that's what he would do in their place. And of course they wouldn't do this. There were some people who left comments like they wouldn't let Feanor out. I'm like, I know they wouldn't, but Sauron has to think that they would, because that's what he would do in that situation. Just sort of unleash Feanor, say, hey, that Sauron guy, he has one of the Silmarils, go get him. And nothing would stop him, not even death. So there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Dan Linder, who asks, are there any fictional creatures in Tolkien's universe? For example, are the stone giants real? The stone giants are real. I mean, they were in The Hobbit. I don't think that there are things that we know that Bilbo probably made up. The giants are not one of them. They weren't literally made from stone, though. They were just giants of the mountain. As for there being fictional creatures in Tolkien's universes, possibly, but there is a thread that we must follow, the possibility that all such fictional beasts are actually, in fact, real. There are several beings in Tolkien's universe that seem to be fictional, in the sense that they don't actually exist in Middle-earth, but only exist in tales that are told in Middle-earth. However, we learn that sometimes they actually are real. A lot of the examples that people highlight for this that I saw in other people that tried to answer this question were brought up in Hobbit verse. And two such examples, the Mulips and the Fastidakalan, are trotted out. That's why I read those poems earlier. However, there is another Hobbit verse that is about a supposedly mythical creature, which I shall recite here for you. Gray as a mouse, big as a house, nose like a snake, I make the earth shake. As I tramp through the grass, trees crack as I pass. With horns in my mouth, I walk in the south, flapping big ears beyond the count of years. I stump round and round, never lie on the ground, not even to die. Oliphant am I, biggest of all, huge, old, and tall. If ever you'd met me, you wouldn't forget me. If you never do, you won't think I'm true, but old Oliphant am I, and I never lie. So this bit of Hobbit verse was something that Sam recited to Gollum when asking about Oliphant, something that Gollum had never heard of. Sam quickly admits that it may or may not be nonsense. He isn't sure. Gollum states that he never saw any such creature. However, it isn't very long before Sam gets to see one up close. Of course, the creature has a different name, a Mumak, or the plural Mumakil. So Sam finds, that a rhyme that he learned about giant creatures from the south is true. A lot of Hobbit verse may be applying real things into a sort of fairy story or nursery rhyme context. Bilbo in The Hobbit mentions fairies and the legend that a Took ancestor wed a fairy, accounting for the Took longevity and their passion for adventure. He dismisses it as nonsense. However, in study of the early legendarium, we see that fairy as well as gnome were descriptors of different types of elves. In the earliest lay of Luthien, that's Beren and Luthien, Beren is described as an elf and Luthien is described as a fairy, and there's some other characters that are referred to as gnomes. Gnome later became Noldor, though interestingly the gnomish language became Sindarin. Tolkien stopped using fairy for similar reasons. It gave his critics the wrong sort of idea about what he was talking about, and there's a good point to that. Fairies are still mentioned here and there, but may be what some hobbits call elves, particularly hobbits who've never met elves and may not even believe they exist. Bilbo, as someone who, even before The Hobbit knew of elves and would often seek them out, would know better, which may be why he dismisses the local legend as bunk. So, Mulips and Fastidakalan may describe real things that hobbits turned into fantastical creatures of their own verse. The description of Mulips being these undead creatures who live in swamps and drag people to their demise don't seem that unusual when we later read about Frodo's journey through the dead marshes. And in Tolkien's notes found in the book Mr. Baggins, we learn that initially he not only intended the Mulips to be real, but that Bilbo and Thorin and company would even run into them. Fastidakalan is described as being giant sea monsters, or it may be the name of a specific giant sea monster, or a type of giant sea monster. I think it's a name, though. And they're sort of like big turtles that disguise themselves as islands. And this may be an allusion to Tol Eressëa, which was a moving island that bore the elves to the Undying Lands in the deeps of time. What became Hobbit verse may have started off with an assumption that if an island moved, it must be alive. And of course, why would it tip people over and drown them? We know that hobbits fear drowning. They're not very good swimmers. So it's sort of like a lot of nursery rhymes are sort of scary, or they are cautionary tales, so that may be where that came from. Tolkien hints at, this sort of origin in letter 255 when he describes the verse as a hobbit alteration of something more learned and elvish. We see in this practice in the poem Errantry, which was written by Bilbo Baggins after his first stay in Rivendell. He writes of a knight on a quest battling, many sorts of ridiculous creatures, all seemingly versions of very large bees. It is suggested that while Bilbo stayed with the elves, they told him tales and songs of the First Age, and he didn't know that they were meant to be taken seriously. He didn't know that this was literally their history. He thought it was just, elvish fairy tales and songs. and so he wrote a Hobbit version. And we can see parallels between the knight attempting to wed a butterfly and the tale of Beren and Luthien, though Bilbo's whimsical, and patter-sung poetry. So, while there may indeed be creatures mentioned in verses that absolutely don't exist, the truth of the matter seems to be that most of them have a kernel of truth to them and are based off of something that, that the writer of the verse did not understand or perhaps assumed was not real. And now let's move on to our final question. Our final question comes in from OK Librarian, and I kind of really hope this person's actually a librarian, just because I think it's a very noble pursuit and a very underpaid and underappreciated pursuit. Perhaps they're a librarian from Oklahoma. But anyway, here's the question. What reading order would you suggest for someone who has read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings several times and is ready to delve deeper into the Legendarium? So this actually depends on what do you want to get out of it. If you're looking to just learn about the deeper lore and the history behind Tolkien's Legendarium, the next stop would either be, and I'm going to grab the relevant books here, would either be the Silmarillion, or, where is Unfinished Tales? Oh, there it is. Unfortunately, I don't have the dust jacket on. It was in really bad shape, so you'll just have to trust me that that's Unfinished Tales there. I took the dust jacket was so tattered, I took it off. So either one of those. And there's, advantages and disadvantages for doing either before the other. So let's talk about the advantages of reading Unfinished Tales first. Each story in Unfinished Tales is self-contained, and they don't need to be read in any particular order. If you're coming right off of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there's stories in there like The Quest of Erebor and The Hunt for the Ring that fill in big gaps and help to supplement what you've already read. The fourth section in Unfinished Tales gives important information that is not seen in The Lord of the Rings' appendices, most notably about the Palantiri and the wizards. And both of the First Age stories of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin and the tale of the children of Húrin are extremely well written, and they give an excellent introduction to the First Age. However, starting with Unfinished Tales gives us some disadvantages. Many of the stories are, as suggested by the title, not complete. This is especially egregious in Aldarion and Rendis, which just stops with no resolution. The Children of Húrin has the beginning part of the story and the end part of the story with a requirement to read specific pages from the Silmarillion to fill in the gaps. You can see where that can get a little bit complicated. Some of the stories have multiple versions, and you have to read a lot of the footnotes to get full context and then make a decision as to which version you prefer. Much of the second and the fourth section is a lot of info dumping, and it's not narrative driven. Then, of course, there are the advantages of starting with the Silmarillion. You're getting a fresh start with no required reading beforehand, as it starts with the creation myth and then rolls on through at a breakneck pace on to the end of The Lord of the Rings. Though the text is rather dense due to the fast pace and a lot of information being thrown at you very quickly, the chapters are, for the most part, very short, making it easy to go back and study them as needed before moving on. You can gain a better appreciation of Unfinished Tales, as well as both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, by rereading them after the Silmarillion. Then there are some disadvantages to starting with the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion's pace can be extremely off-putting for people who are fans of The Lord of the Rings. There's no loving descriptions of scenery, dialogue is kept to a minimum. It's mostly just a chronicle and really an outline for more detailed stories. You are sort of just thrown into the middle of the story of the Children of Húrin without getting much in the way of knowing the circumstances of Tuor and Turambar's quest. And the Silmarillion backtracks a few times by getting ahead of itself, telling you what happens, and then sometimes backing up to give a different part of the story. And this may be familiar, as this is how The Two Towers was written, but it's also just, done to an extreme in the Silmarillion. Of course, all of this applies if what you're trying to get out of this is to learn lore and gain a deep appreciation of the Legendarium. If you just want a story, Not that one. Oh, it's over here. Yeah. If you just read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and you've read them many times, and you just want a story, this is the one I recommend. The Children of Húrin, because you're getting the entire story. You're getting the bits that were in Unfinished Tales. You're getting the bits that were in the Silmarillion, and it's all sort of blended together and edited together very wonderfully. And so that's what I would recommend. And then you would decide, is that setting of the First Age in Beleriand interesting enough that you would want to read more about the First Age? And then I would say, well, then you would, delve into what I mentioned earlier, Unfinished Tales and or the Silmarillion. They really do kind of go together. It's hard to recommend one before the other. It really is just, which one do you want to do? Anyway, that was our final question. And I hope I hear from OK Librarian. I want to know if they're actually a librarian and if they're from Oklahoma. It's just interesting to me because I think it's wonderful to be a librarian. It's a thankless job, but I think it's important. Anyway, that was our last question. So if you got all the way through the video, now's the time that you have to subscribe if you haven't already. I mean, you're pretty much legally obligated to. I am hypnotizing you, and your hand is moving to the subscribe button. No, but for real, if you like the content, please do subscribe. Leave me a like, because that helps. It seems meaningless, but it really does help the algorithm. Leave me a comment, even if it's just to say hi. Tell me you enjoyed the video. Ask me a question, whatever you got. Leave me a comment. That's always very helpful as well. Keep an eye out for live streams. Keep an eye on the community tab. We're going to be doing some new things as well that are going to be very exciting. I will see you guys next time.